But if he did, hoping he'd feel that I loved him. That was the real George H.W. Bush, a loving man with a big, vibrant, all-enveloping heart. And so we ask, as we commend his soul to God, and as he did, why him? Why was he spared? The workings of providence are mysterious, but this much is clear. The George Herbert Walker Bush, who survived that fiery fall into the waters of the Pacific 3/4 of a century ago, made our lives and the lives of nations freer, better, warmer, and nobler. That was his mission. That was his heartbeat. And if we listen closely enough, we can hear that heartbeat even now. For it's the heartbeat of a lion who not only led us, but who loved us. That's why him. That's why he was spared.
A reading from Revelation to St. John. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "See, the home of God is among mortals. He will dwell with them. They will be his peoples, and God himself will be with them. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more, for the first things have passed away." Then he said to me, "It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty I will give water as a gift from the spring of the water of life. Those who conquer will inherit these things, and I will be their God, and they will be my children. And the city has no need of sun or moon to shine on it, for the glory of God is its light, and the lamp is the Lamb. The nations will walk by its light, and the kings of the earth will bring their glory into it. Its gates will never be shut by day, and there will be no night there." The word of the Lord.
Do you remember where you were? The summer you left your teenage years behind and turned 20. Well, I was working as a laborer in my hometown in northern Quebec, trying to make enough money to get back into law school. It was a tough job, but I was safe and secure, and had the added benefit of my mother's home cooking every night. On September 2nd, 1944, as we have just heard so eloquently from John, 20-year-old Lieutenant George Bush was preparing to attack Japanese war installations in the Pacific. He was part of a courageous generation of young Americans who led the charge against overwhelming odds in the historic and bloody battle for supremacy in the Pacific against the colossal military might of Imperial Japan. That's what George Bush did the summer he turned 20. Many men of differing talents and skills have served as president, and many more will do so as the decades unfold, bringing new strength and glory to these United States of America. And 50 or 100 years from now, as historians review the accomplishments and the context of all who have served as president, I believe it will be said that in the life of this country, the United States, which is, in my judgment, the greatest democratic republic that God has ever placed on the face of this earth, I believe it will be said that no occupant of the Oval Office was more courageous, more principled, and more honorable than George Herbert Walker Bush. George Bush was a man of high accomplishment but he also had a delightful sense of humor and was a lot of fun. At his first NATO meeting in Brussels, as the new American president, he sat opposite me, actually, that day. George was taking copious notes as the heads of government spoke. We were all limited in time. But you know, it's very flattering to have the President of the United States take notes as you speak. And even someone as modest as me threw in a few more adjectives here and there to extend the pleasure of the experience. After President Mitterrand, Prime Minister Thatcher, and Chancellor Kohl had spoken, it was the turn of the Prime Minister of Iceland, who, as President Bush continued to write, went on and on and on and on, ending only when the Secretary General of NATO firmly decreed a coffee break. George put down his pen, walked over to me and said, "Brian, I've just learned the fundamental principle of international affairs." I said, "What's that, George?" He said, "The smaller the country, the longer the speech." In the second year of the Bush presidency, responding to implacable pressures from the Reagan and Bush administrations, the Soviet Union imploded. This was, in my judgment, the most epical event, political event of the 20th century. An ominous situation that could have become extremely menacing to world security was instead deftly challenged by the leadership of President Bush into the broad and powerful currents of freedom, providing the Russian people with the opportunity to build an embryonic democracy in a country that had been ruled by czars and tyrants for over 1,000 years. And then, as the Berlin Wall collapsed soon thereafter, and calls for freedom cascaded across Central and Eastern Europe, leaving dictators and dogma in the trash can of history, no challenge assumed greater importance for Western solidarity than the unification of Germany within an unswerving NATO. But old fears in Western Europe and unrelenting hostility by the military establishment in the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact rendered this initiative among the most complex and sensitive ever undertaken. One serious misstep, and this entire process could have been compromised, perhaps irretrievably. There's obviously no more knowledgeable or competent judge of what really happened at this most vital juncture of the 20th century than Chancellor Helmut Kohl of Germany. In a speech to a parliamentary commission of the Bundestag, Chancellor Kohl said categorically that this historic initiative of German reunification could never, ever have succeeded without the brilliant leadership of President Bush. Much has been written about the first Gulf War. Simply put, the coalition of 29 disparate nations assembled under the aegis of the United Nations, including for the first time many influential Arab countries, and led by the United States, will rank with the most spectacular and successful international initiatives ever undertaken in modern history, designed to punish an aggressor, defend the cause of freedom, and ensure order in a region that had seen too much of the opposite for far too long. This was President Bush's initiative from beginning to end. President Bush was also responsible for the North American Free Trade Agreement, recently modernized and improved by new administrations, which created the largest and richest free trade area in the history of the world, while also signing into law the Americans with Disabilities Act, which transformed the lives of millions and millions of Americans forever. President Bush's decision to go forward with strong environmental legislation, including the Clean Air Act, that resulted in the Acid Rain Accord with Canada, is a splendid gift to future generations of Americans and Canadians to savor in the air they breathe and the water they drink, and the forests they enjoy, and the lakes, rivers, and streams they cherish. There's a word for this. It's called leadership. Leadership. And let me tell you that when George Bush was President of the United States of America, every single head of government in the world knew that they were dealing with a gentleman, a genuine leader, one who was distinguished, resolute, and brave. I don't keep a diary, but occasionally I write private notes after important personal or professional events. One occurred at Walker's Point in Kennebunkport, Maine, on September 2nd, 2001. Mila and I had been spending our traditional Labor Day weekend with George and Barbara, and towards the end, he and I had a long private conversation. My notes capture the moment. I told George how I thought his mood had shifted over the last 8 years, from a series of frustrations and moments of despondency in 1993 to the high enthusiasm that I felt at the Houston launch of the Presidential Library, and George W.'s election as governor in November of that year, to the delight following Jeb's election in 1998, followed by their great pride and pleasure with George W.'s election to the presidency, and perhaps most importantly, to the serenity we found today in both Barbara and George. They are truly at peace with themselves, joyous in what they and the children have achieved, gratified by the goodness that God has bestowed upon them all, and genuinely content with the thrill and promise of each passing day. And at that, George, who had tears in his eyes as I spoke, said, "You know, Brian, you've got us pegged just right, and the roller coaster of emotions we've experienced since 1992. Come with me." He led me down the porch at Walker's Point to the side of the house that fronts the ocean and pointed to a small, simple plaque that had been unobtrusively installed just some days earlier. It read, CAVU. George said, "Brian, this stands for Ceiling and Visibility Unlimited. When I was a terrified 18 to 19-year-old pilot in the Pacific, those were the words we hoped to hear before takeoff. It meant perfect flying. And that's the way I feel about our life today. CAVU. Everything is perfect. Bar and I could not have asked for better lives. We are truly happy and truly at peace." As I looked over the waters of Walker's Point on that golden September afternoon in Maine, I was reminded of the lines, simple and true, that speak to the real nature of George Bush and his love of his wonderful family and precious surroundings. There are wooden ships, there are sailing ships, there are ships that sail the sea. But the best ships are friendships, and may they always be.
Relax, George told me I only had 10 minutes. He was very direct about it. It wasn't even funny. Now, I first met my dear friend, George Bush, in 1962, when my father, Millward Simpson, was a member of the United States Senate and just elected. And I came back to Washington with Dad to settle on his new office, being vacated by one Senator Prescott Bush, George's father. Well, then we met again when my parents left Washington and sold their home to a brand spanking new congressman from Texas named George Herbert Walker Bush. So George and Barbara, Mom and Pop, did that sale on a handshake. Sound familiar? Then I came to the Senate in 1978, and soon after that, Ronald Reagan cornered me and asked me to support him for president. And I said I would, not knowing that my friend George would enter the fray. Hearing that, I called and I said, George, I want to tell you I'd love to help, but I already committed to Ronald Reagan. George's response? Well, Al, I'm sorry about that. I probably should have let you know sooner. And actually, a guy doesn't get very many calls from a friend who says they can't support him. Sound familiar? Of course it does. Because in George Bush's theme of life, during all the highs and lows, there was a simple credo. What would we do without family and friends? And when he became vice president, our friendship, our enjoyable friendship, was refreshed, and the four of us had many, many pleasant times together. Now, my life in Washington was rather tumultuous. I went from the A social list to the Z, and never came back to the A. In one dark period, I was feeling awful low, and all my wounds were self-inflicted, all of them. And George called me early one morning, always early in the morning, country music playing in the background, and he said, I see the media is shooting you pretty full of holes. Actually, he said it a bit more pungently than that. And he said, why don't we go up to Camp David? You and Ann come over and we'll have a weekend together. At that time, his popularity rating was 93%. Mine was 0.93. And so off we went. The media, of course, all gathered as we headed to Marine One. And George said, now wave to your pals over there in the media, Al. And they didn't wave back. So next morning, he's ratting through all the papers in the U.S., and he looks up and he said, aha, here's the one I've been looking for. A picture of Barbara and Ann and George with his arm and hand on my back. And later, we're having a sauna. And I said, George, I am not unmindful as to what you are doing. You are propping up your old wounded duck pal. While you're at the top of your game, you reach out to me while I'm tangled in rich controversy and taking my lumps, and he said, yep. There were staff members, Al, who told me not to do this. But Al, this is about friendship and loyalty. Sound familiar? Well, we had an awful lot of fun, too. Always a delight to be in the president's box at the Kennedy Center, off to a play at the National Theater of the Warner with the Bushes. And outside of the president's box one evening, there was a massive 6-foot vase with an extraordinary glaze. I hope you know the difference between a vase and a vase. $35. Now, George walked up to it and he said, Al, wait, I think that's Etruscan. I noticed that, he said, this blue-grayish glaze from that period, a clay that could only be found during that era. And I said, no, George. The patina there gives me the perception it was possibly older, perhaps of Greek origin, with that particular herbal paste before firing. Well, of course, people gathered around, mumbling about these expert observers. And Barbara and Ann finally came by and said, "Get out of here. Both of you, get back in that box." Well, we did. Well, it was impressive for a while. And then, of course, one night, the four of us went to see Michael Crawford, singing the songs of Andrew Lloyd Webber. All four of us were singing as we went back to the White House. "Don't cry for me, Argentina." And tidbits from Phantom of the Opera and other magic of Webber. And a few days later, he's getting hammered by the press for some extraordinarily petty bit of trivia. And suddenly he sings out, "Don't cry for me, Argentina." The press then wrote that he was finally losing his marbles. Now, these honored guests right here before us, who have held this noble post, know well of the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. He was a class act from birth to death. He housed the strong sinews in mind and body gained from that extraordinary mother. We compared our mothers as velvet hammers, of course, and certainly most awesome fathers. The history books will and are treating him most fairly, while uncovering some other powerful traits: his great competitiveness, his raw courage, and his self-discipline. Recall the Andrews Air Base conclave, where congressional participants drafted a remarkable bill that dealt with two-year budgeting, entitlement reform, comprehensive and catastrophic health care, Social Security solvency, and much more. But it required a critical ingredient called revenue, translated into the word taxes, translated into the words "read my lips." And the group went to George and said, "Look, we can get this package done, but we must have some revenue." And he said, I'll never forget, he said, "What I've said on that subject sure puts a hell of a lot of heat on me." And then they all said, "Yes, but we can get it done, and it will be bipartisan." And George said, "Okay, go for it, but it will be a real punch in the gut." Bob Dole, then, a loyal warrior for George, took it back to the Senate, and we won a very strong bipartisan vote. And went over to the House, where his own party turned on him. Surely one of the main factors assuring his return to private life. But he often said, when the really tough choices come, it's the country, not me. It's not about Democrats or Republicans. It's for our country that I fought for. And he was a man of such great humility. Those who travel the high road of humility in Washington, D.C. are not bothered by heavy traffic. And he had a very serious flaw, known by all close to it. He loved a good joke. The richer, the better. And he'd throw his head back and give that great laugh, but he never, ever could remember a punchline. And I mean never. So the punchline for George Herbert Walker Bush is this: you would have wanted him on your side. He never lost his sense of humor. Humor is the universal solvent against the abrasive elements of life. That's what humor is. He never hated anyone. He knew what his mother and my mother always knew: Hatred corrodes the container it's carried in. The most decent and honorable person I ever met was my friend George Bush, one of nature's noblemen. His epitaph, perhaps just a single letter, the letter L for loyalty. It coursed through his blood. Loyalty to his country, loyalty to his family, loyalty to his friends, loyalty to the institutions of government, and always, always, always a friend to his friends. None of us were ready for this day. We mourn his loss from our own lives and what he was to each of us. That is so personal, so intimate, so down inside. It would have been so much easier to celebrate his life with him here, but he is gone, irrevocably gone. So now we have loosed our grip upon him, but we shall always retain his memory in our hearts. God has come now to take him back. We all knew on one unknown day he would return to his God. So now we give him up. We commend him to your loving hands. Thank you for him. God rest his soul.
History of America, there are names that shine like beacons in the night. The patriots whose vision gave us meaning, who kept the lamp of freedom burning bright. In the long and honored history of America, there are those who pay the last and final price. Called upon by chance or desperate circumstance to make the ultimate sacrifice. A grateful nation bows its head in sorrow, and in thanks for guaranteeing a tomorrow. The last full measure of devotion, that's what they gave to the cause. The last full measure of devotion, and though they cannot hear our applause, we honor them forever and keep alive their story, pay tribute to their lives, and give them all the glory. Beyond the call of duty with the deeds, the last full measure of devotion, and they gave their lives to serve the greater need. And those who did survive and came back home alive, they join in praise of comrades who were slain. on the call of duty were there these. The last full measure of devotion, he gave himself to serve the greater needs. And for those who did survive and came back home alive, they join in praise of comrades who were slain.
Distinguished guests, including our presidents and first ladies, government officials, foreign dignitaries, and friends. Jeb, Neil, Marvin, Daro, and I, and our families, thank you all for being here. I once heard it said of man that the idea is to die young as late as possible. At age 85, a favorite pastime of George H.W. Bush was firing up his boat, the Fidelity, and opening up the 300 horsepower engines to fly, joyfully fly, across the Atlantic with the Secret Service boats straining to keep up. At age 90, George H.W. Bush parachuted out of an aircraft and landed on the grounds of St. Anne's by the Sea in Kennebunkport, Maine, the church where his mom was married and where he worshiped often. Mother liked to say he chose the location just in case the chute didn't open. In his 90s, he took great delight when his closest pal, James A. Baker, smuggled a bottle of Grey Goose vodka into his hospital room. Apparently, it paired well with the steak Baker had delivered from Morton's. To his very last days, Dad's life was instructive. As he aged, he taught us how to grow with dignity, humor, and kindness. And when the good Lord finally called, how to meet him with courage and with the joy of the promise of what lies ahead. One reason Dad knew how to die young is that he almost did it, twice. When he was a teenager, a staph infection nearly took his life. A few years later, he was alone in the Pacific on a life raft, praying that his rescuers would find him before the enemy did. God answered those prayers. It turned out he had other plans for George H.W. Bush. For Dad's part, I think those brushes with death made him cherish the gift of life, and he vowed to live every day to the fullest. Dad was always busy, a man in constant motion, but never too busy to share his love of life with those around him. He taught us to love the outdoors. He loved watching dogs flush a covey. He loved landing the elusive striper. And once confined to a wheelchair, he seemed happiest sitting in his favorite perch on the back porch at Walker's Point, contemplating the majesty of the Atlantic. The horizons he saw were bright and hopeful. He was a genuinely optimistic man, and that optimism guided his children and made each of us believe that anything was possible. He continually broadened his horizons with daring decisions. He was a patriot. After high school, he put college on hold and became a Navy fighter pilot as World War II broke out. Like many of his generation, he never talked about his service until his time as a public figure forced his hand. We learned of the attack on Chichijima, the mission completed, the shoot-down. We learned of the death of his crewmates, whom he thought about throughout his entire life. And we learned of the rescue. And then another audacious decision. He moved his young family from the comforts of the East Coast to Odessa, Texas. He and Mom adjusted to their arid surroundings quickly. He was a tolerant man. After all, he was kind and neighborly to the women with whom he, Mom, and I shared a bathroom in our small duplex. Even after he learned their profession, ladies of the night. Dad could relate to people from all walks of life. He was an empathetic man. He valued character over pedigree, and he was no cynic. He looked for the good in each person, and he usually found it. Dad taught us that public service is noble and necessary, that one can serve with integrity and hold true to the important values like faith and family. He strongly believed that it was important to give back to the community and country in which one lived. He recognized that serving others enriched the giver's soul. To us, his was the brightest of 1,000 points of light. In victory, he shared credit. When he lost, he shouldered the blame. He accepted that failure is a part of living a full life, but taught us never to be defined by failure. He showed us how setbacks can strengthen. None of his disappointments could compare with one of life's greatest tragedies, the loss of a young child. Jeb and I were too young to remember the pain and agony he and Mom felt when our 3-year-old sister died. We only learned later that Dad, a man of quiet faith, prayed for her daily. He was sustained by the love of the Almighty and the real and enduring love of her mom. Dad always believed that one day he would hug his precious Robin again. He loved to laugh, especially at himself. He could tease and needle, but never out of malice. He placed great value on a good joke. That's why he chose Simpson to speak. On email, he had a circle of friends with whom he shared or received the latest jokes. His grading system for the quality of the joke was classic George Bush. The rare 7s and 8s were considered huge winners, most of them off color. George Bush knew how to be a true and loyal friend. He nurtured and honored his many friendships with a generous and giving soul. There exist thousands of handwritten notes encouraging or sympathizing or thanking his friends and acquaintances. He had an enormous capacity to give of himself. Many a person would tell you that Dad became a mentor and a father figure in their life. He listened and he consoled. He was their friend. I think of Don Rhodes, Taylor Blanton, Jim Nance, Arnold Schwarzenegger, and perhaps the unlikeliest of all, the man who defeated him, Bill Clinton. My siblings and I refer to the guys in this group as brothers from other mothers. He taught us that a day was not meant to be wasted. He played golf at a legendary pace. I always wondered why he insisted on speed golf. He was a good golfer. Well, here's my conclusion. He played fast so that he could move on to the next event, to enjoy the rest of the day, to expend his enormous energy, to live it all. He was born with just 2 settings, full throttle, then sleep. Taught us what it means to be a wonderful father, grandfather, and great-grandfather. He was firm in his principles and supportive as we began to seek our own ways. He encouraged and comforted, but never steered. We tested his patience. I know I did. But he always responded with the great gift of unconditional love. Last Friday, when I was told he had minutes to live, I called him. The guy answered the phone, said I think he can hear you, but he hadn't said anything for most of the day. I said, Dad, I love you and you've been a wonderful father. And the last words he would ever say on earth were, I love you too. To us, he was close to perfect, but not totally perfect. His short game was lousy. He wasn't exactly Fred Astaire on the dance floor. The man couldn't stomach vegetables, especially broccoli. And by the way, he passed these genetic defects along to us. Finally, every day of his 73 years of marriage, Dad taught us all what it means to be a great husband. He married his sweetheart. He adored her. He laughed and cried with her. He was dedicated to her totally. In his old age, Dad enjoyed watching police show reruns, the volume on high, all the while holding Mom's hand. After Mom died, Dad was strong, but all he really wanted to do was hold Mom's hand again. Of course, Dad taught me another special lesson. He showed me what it means to be a president who serves with integrity, leads with courage, and acts with love in his heart for the citizens of our country. When the history books are written, they will say that George H.W. Bush was a great president of the United States, a diplomat of unmatched skill, a commander-in-chief of formidable accomplishment, and a gentleman who executed the duties of his office with dignity and honor. In his inaugural address, the 41st President of the United States said this: "We cannot hope only to leave our children a bigger car, a bigger bank account. We must hope to give them a sense of what it means to be a loyal friend, a loving parent, a citizen who leaves his home, his neighborhood, and town better than he found it. What do we want the men and women who work with us to say when we are no longer there? That we were more driven to succeed than anyone around us, or that we stopped to ask if a sick child had gotten better and stayed a moment there to trade a word of friendship? Well, Dad, we're going to remember you for exactly that and much more. And we're going to miss you. Your decency, sincerity, and kind soul will stay with us forever. So through our tears, let us know the blessings of knowing and loving you, a great and noble man, the best father a son or daughter could have. And in our grief, let us smile knowing that Dad is hugging Robin and holding Mom's hand again."
Please stand. The Holy Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ according to Matthew. Jesus said, "You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before men, that they may see your good deeds and praise your Father in heaven." The Gospel of the Lord.
Bow your heads in prayer, please. Almighty God of all comfort, console us. Of all light, strengthen us. Of all love, inspire us to love you and to love those you send our way. Amen. Well, please be seated. It is a tremendous honor to follow these speakers, and especially someone whom I admire so much, our 43rd president. Sir, your father always welcomed my visits and never made me feel rushed, and always said thank you for coming, never made me feel like I was going on too long. Your mother usually said, "Good sermon, too long." I got your email. You're a lot like your mother. Ladies and gentlemen, children of God, when death comes, as it does to us all, life is changed, not ended. And the way we live our lives, the decisions we make, the service we render matter. They matter to our fellow human beings, to this world that God has given to us, and they matter to God. And few people have understood this as well or lived their lives as accordingly as President George Herbert Walker Bush. Now, hear what I said, lived it, not earned it or strived to achieve it. It was as natural to him as breathing is to each of us. President Bush was a good man, a decent man, a godly man, full of grace and love and a quality of absolute necessity to enter the kingdom of God, humility, grounded in a desire to serve his God and all God sent his way. How do I know this? Because for nearly a dozen years, my wife, Laura, and our children and I, we have laughed with him, we have fished with him. President Bush brought up riding in Fidelity. We had that pleasure as well. The Secret Service was behind us. He was at full throttle. I saw many of them reaching for what I thought were protective armor, but then I realized as they followed the president, they were actually crossing themselves. We've been blessed to share meals and tears and moments of silence and prayers in times of great strength and times of great weakness. Never, not once, did I witness anything but care and concern for those around him. The job of a pastor, a priest, an imam, a rabbi, when dealing with someone he or she is called to serve, is to call on them to look to God, to do the right thing, to serve others, and to love. And President Bush made my job so easy. Our lesson from the Hebrew Scriptures remind us that God is light, and the president reflected that light his whole life through. He once said, "I'm a man who sees life in terms of missions defined and missions completed." And we recall with delight when he reminded America and her citizens of his mission and ours to be points of light with but one aim: to leave our world better than we found it. I have a political cartoon of the 41st president. I keep it in my desk with caricatured big ears. He's sitting in his desk, he's looking at his watch, and he's saying to himself, "Communism is dead, the wall is down, apartheid is falling, Mandela is free, the Sandinistas are ousted, Germany is reuniting, the Cold War is over, I've returned my calls, and heck, it's not even lunchtime." We sometimes forget all that President Bush did for us, in large part because he preferred to shine not upon himself, but to shine to others. Several years ago, President Bush gave me this plaque. And on the back's a note, "Russ, a good friend gave this to me some years ago. It may be of help to you in some way." It reads simply, "Preach Christ at all times. If necessary, use words." It remains on my desk as a reminder that faith means more than words. Jesus Christ, for George Bush, was at the heart of his faith. But his was a deep faith, a generous faith, a simple faith in the best sense of the word. He knew and lived Jesus' two greatest commandments, to love God and to love your neighbor. The president loved and served not just some, but all that God sent his way. He lived his own adage that tolerance is a virtue, not a vice. He respected and befriended Christians of every denomination, as well as Jews and Muslims and Buddhists and Sikhs. His comrades were from every nation and race. Yes, he was a Republican, but for him, political parties were but a line in the sand to brush away in times of the greater good of working toward his goal for all of us to be that kinder and gentler nation. The gospel that Dean Hollerith just read for us a moment ago reminds us that Jesus told his followers to be the light of the world so that the world could turn their hearts toward God and toward others. Let your light shine before others so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. And so was President Bush. His life was defined by his faith and his service that are worthy of all those made in God's image. In September of 1990, President Bush spoke to those gathered outside those doors for the dedication of this great cathedral. And he pointed inside to that magnificent rose window right there from the outside, and he spoke these words, "From where we now stand, the rose window high above seems black and formless to some, perhaps. But when we enter, we see it backlit by the sun. It dazzles in astonishing splendor and reminds us that without faith, we too are but stained glass windows in the dark." The president understood that even in the darkest of nights, things can be transformed if handed over to the redemptive power of the Almighty. No one on that first Good Friday expected Easter Sunday, but it came. It came because the light that brought creation into being also brought life from the grave. We call that resurrection. Only days ago, I was humbled, along with members of the president's staff, his outstanding and loyal medical team, so many friends, Sully, who I believe has gotten more press than the president in the last few days, loving members of his family who called in, who spoke with him throughout the day, and as our 43rd president just said, inspired his last words, words of love. Sitting with us was someone the president liked to call his little brother, James Baker, and his wife, Susan. As I said, there have been wonderful hugs and kind words throughout the day, kisses throughout the day. Toward the end, Secretary Baker and I were sitting on the sofa next to one another a few steps away, and he whispered to me, "You know, that man changed my life." A bit later, Secretary Baker was at the foot of the president's bed. And toward the end, Jim Baker rubbed and stroked the president's feet for perhaps half an hour. The president smiled at the comfort of his dear friend. Here I witnessed a world leader who was serving, a servant who had been our world's leader. And what came to mind was Jesus. On that last night before his own crucifixion, having said everything there was to say, he wrapped a towel around his waist and without words, he washed his disciples' feet. As Jesus finished, he said, "I've set an example for you. Do as I have done. Serve one another. By this, the world will know you're my disciples, if you serve and if you love one another." At the end, we all knelt. We all placed our hands on the president. We said our prayers together. And then we were silent for a full, long measure as this man who changed all of our lives, who changed our nation, who changed our world, left this life for the next. It was a beautiful end. It was a beautiful beginning. For a moment, but a moment only, that dear point of light we know as George Herbert Walker Bush dimmed, but it now shines brighter than it ever before has. And now this godly man, this servant, this child of God is in the loving arms of Barbara and Robin and the welcoming arms of our Lord who embraced him with his divine love. Some have said in the last few days, this is an end of an era, but it does not have to be. Perhaps it's an invitation to fill the hole that has been left behind. The president so loved his church. He loved the Episcopal Church. He so loved our great nation. He so loved you, his friends. He so loved every member of his family. But he was so ready to go to heaven. And heaven was so ready to receive him because he lived those two great commandments. If you want to honor him, and if you call yourself a daughter or a son of God, then love God, love your neighbor. There's no greater mission on planet Earth. My hunch is heaven, as perfect as it must be, just got a bit kinder and gentler, leaving behind that hole for you and me to fill. How? Preach Christ at all times. If necessary, use words. So, Mr. President, mission complete. Well done, good and faithful servant. Welcome to your eternal home, where ceiling and visibility are unlimited, and life goes on forever. Amen.
Packing up the dreams God planted in the fertile soil of you. I can't believe the hopes He's granted it won't even seem you've gone. 'Cause our hearts in big and small ways will keep the love that keeps us strong. Friends are friends forever if the Lord's the Lord of them. And a friend will not say never, 'cause the welcome will not end. Though it's hard to let you go, in the Father's hands we know that a lifetime's not too long to live as friends. With the faith and love God's given, springing from the hope we know, and we will pray the joy you're living is the strength that now you show. But we'll keep you close as always. It won't even seem you've gone. And 'cause our hearts in big and small ways will keep the love that keeps us strong. Friends are friends forever if the Lord's the Lord of them. And a friend will not say never, 'cause the welcome will not end. Though it's hard to let you go, in the Father's hands we know that a lifetime's not too long to live as friends. Friends are friends forever if the Lord's the Lord of them. And a friend will not say never, 'cause the welcome will not end. Though it's hard to let you go, in the Father's hands we know that a lifetime's not too long to live as friends. No, a lifetime's not too long to live as friends.